In 1996, a drunken Mandy Meeks stumbled and slurred his way onto our screens, screaming at his peers, "You don't know the rules? There are certain rules one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie. For instance, number one, you can never have sex. Big no no, big no no. Sex equals death, okay? Number two, you can never drink or do drugs. It's the sin factor. It's a sin. It's an extension of rule number one. And number three, you can never, ever, under any circumstances, say, I'll be right back because you won't be back. See, you push the laws and you end up dead. Hello, and welcome to the Unhinged Binge. I'm Lego, and I want to go on a rant because that's what I do. Now, in this episode, where I document my ever inclining insanity, I'm going to talk about sex, baby, and how doing it as an unmarried teen will lead to you being brutally killed by Michael Myers if you're at home, or Jason Voorhees if you're out camping. This will be uploaded in audio form and as a video on YouTube. Doing my best. This is a different format that I'm used to. You probably will be able to hear my mouse clicking. I apologize for that. I don't know how to edit that out. So just work with me here. I'm going to be talking about the sex equals death trope in the horror film because sex and violence go together like love and marriage. And I was inspired to do this on a study that I read called The Perils of Living Dangerously in the Slasher Film, as well as a statistic that I read in Teen Slasher Movie Book. And I decided smartly to spend about 3 months worth of my downtime researching this like a maniac with a mortar board. Anyway, however, before I dive into that, I want to get into lot, a lot of context. Like I'm going to do a dive into explanation on terms and possibly the downfall of society. So, yeah, let's just get into that. A well-known trope in horror movies is sex equals death. And I'd like to unpack that a lot. Maybe a little bit too much. We'll see how it goes. This is a 24-page paper I wrote, basically. So first, let's narrow things down a bit. The sex equals death is a trope in a subgenre of horror, specifically slasher films. Although additionally, there is a targeting of virgins in vampire films and the cult like satanic panic witch movies. I think we should talk a little bit about what a trope is. So I found a great definition from No Film School. A film or TV trope is the consistent or expected use of certain characters, situations, settings, and time periods across a specific genre. The word has come to be used for common recurring rhetorical devices, motifs, or cliches within creative works. They further differentiate between a trope and a cliche by saying a cliche is a way you describe a trope that has been seen so many times that it feels tired or worn out. It's an overused and exhausted idea. I think it's safe to assume that we all know what death is. So next we can move on to the last part of the equation, sex. So what is a virgin? I mean, pretty easy. You don't have to look up the definition there. It's someone who's not yet had sex. And that sounds simple. But is it? But is it? But is it? Because what is sex? If you're a sapphic deity like myself, you may have been told that you're still a virgin because sex is a penis penetrating a vagina. But isn't? Because that's a completely heteronormative and, let's be real, kind of vanilla definition of sex. And as it turns out, virginity is a social construct. Don't worry, I'm not going to go into a Marxist feminist rant yet. To let the uncredited writer of Therapy for Women define it, a social construct is something we've made up. It's intangible. It's a story or an idea created by society, Social structures are how humans make sense of their existence. And they go on to say the idea of virginity dates back to primitive era when paternity was essential to maintaining control and ownership of land. This ownership meant ownership of women, and in order to ensure one had ownership, one needed control. And to control, there also had to be fear of consequence. The policing of women's bodies further intensified when Mariology emerged. Mariology is the study of Mary, Mother Jesus, the Blessed Mother, the Virgin Mary, the most revered feminine figure in Christianity, particularly Catholicism. I'll amend what they say when it comes to Mariology. They could have just said Christianity, honestly. Lindsay Betros explains in her second argument for her article for Medium 5 reasons why virginity is a social construct. Virginity is based on patriarchal concepts and is not a medical term. Virginity isn't innate, it's a human creation. We typically think of the origin of virginity from Christian principles. However, the term is from Greek origin. Oh my gosh. Depending on the context, Greek writers would even use the term in a metaphorical sense. With the Virgin Mary, virginity became hand in hand with purity and chastity. And I thought it was very interesting, this idea of the evolution of the concept of virginity going from Greek mythology to Christian mythology. Yeah, that's right, mythology. I said it. So I read further. I found an article from Sutter Health entitled Defining Virginity, which goes on to explain virgin originated from the Greek and Latin word virgo, or maiden. It was often used in Greek mythology to classify several goddesses such as Artemis, aka Diana, and Hestia. Virginity and virgin were once terms of power, strength, and independence used to describe a goddess, or used to describe the goddesses who were immune to temptations of Dionysus, the Greek god of seduction and wine. In medieval times, virginity became a sexual term for heterosexual women who had not been penetrated by a penis. Virginity was classified as a gift from the Christian god only to be released by a husband. It was expected for a woman to remain chaste, a virgin, until marriage. A woman broke her family's honor and was often punished if she was not chaste. In the past few decades, the term virgin has become confusing as people try to label persons of both genders, transgender persons, and all sexual orientations. So they didn't include the question of consent, but I'll mention it. Like, are you still a virgin if your first time, I use air quotes here, wasn't consensual? That has, I think, more recently become a question. And I would say, it's up to the person. And that's a disturbing question to have. I observed from reading books dating back to the 70s up until now on feminist film theory, which originally heavily relied on Freud, Lacan, and Althusian. Oh my gosh, I can't say his name. I'm going to stick with it. Althusian, that's not how it's pronounced. Concepts, which were, phallic-centric and deep in the heteronormative and patriarchal BS. And honestly, reading it is pretty frustrating. And it's not limited to just feminist film theory, but academia in general. When you introduce queer theory, or when people who aren't just cishet white men are allowed to enter into the argument, definitions change. And people tend to get really up in arms when definitions change or expand to embrace what they see as new concepts. Language, words, definitions historically were created by a specific, rather narrow demographic, the one that held power. Yes. Again, this is that white man. And over time, as more people, such as Black people, women, queer people, trans people, etc., were allowed to enter into scholastic spaces to speak and to be heard in those spaces, they began to call into question the validity of some of these terms and definitions for various reasons, from they were lacking, offensive, not comprehensive, to just downright inaccurate. Meaning it's not always so much the definition has changed, it's just that it's been corrected. And virginity isn't real. It's not based in medical fact or in science. It's a socially constructed idea used to control women and empower men. Virginity is typically focused on women. Men are encouraged to have sex, women are encouraged to wait, to be chaste. A man's manhood is called into question if he has not yet had sex, yet a woman's moral character is in jeopardy if she's had premarital sex, which is this wild contradiction, laughable paradox, and worse society, men, put the responsibility of sex in a woman's hands and unintentionally labels women as the gatekeepers of sex who have to like constantly reject men's uncontrollable advances rather than it being a two-way person agreement, like, consent. Yet women are bad seductresses if they give in to the same desires that men have. There is a difference in gender roles here. Having sex for the first time is considered a rite of passage into manhood. That really isn't the same case for women or females, which their main rite of passage would be menstruation. Like, oh hey, yeah, you can have babies now. You're an adult, which is like, no, you're not. Like, no, you're not. So let's move on to the Madonna horror complex. Oh, yeah. It's a Freudian concept that is outdated and nonsense. Pat Gadet wrote in Madonna Horror Complex, Love Without Sex, Sex Without Love. It refers to sexual dysfunction in which some men believe that sex is a dirty act that is only enjoyed by bad women, whores. For these men, all women are divided into two very different groups. The whores, women who are easily seduced and who enjoy the dirty act of sex, and the Madonnas or virgins, um, as in the Virgin Mary, pure women of virtue who would never enjoy sex and who should not be degraded by the sex act. Determining the good from the bad is simple. A woman either has an intact hymen or she doesn't. So hymen equals virgin and good girl. Lack of hymen equals whore and bad girl. And weird side tangent. Okay. I now realize the myth of the hymen. Okay, so like I'm not saying hymens aren't real, they are. But their importance is highly exaggerated. Like I I realized I had no idea what exactly a hymen was, if I'm being honest. Like I had to Google it. I went to public school, okay? And it turned into like a disastrous recreation from that scene in Fried Green Tomatoes. It was bad, guys. Tawanda was not. It's anyway, the story that equates or well, this story that equates the hymen to virginity is like so inaccurate. It's wild. Like, in fact, personally, I have no idea how I lost mine. And from the research I did, apparently a lot of people don't. Like, it's not like a big thing that a lot of people can pinpoint. Oh yeah, this is when I lost mine. Um, it's just it's weird and it's not actually a big deal. So yeah, back to Madonna. Since the complex, like the Madonna horror complex, was conceptualized by Freud, it's labeled as psychology, when in reality, I would say it's more of a social issue that I like to call misogyny. Oddly enough, Barbara Creed and Molly Haskell even were writing about this in the 70s with a much better description of this issue, and that's the virgin whore dichotomy. So you're either a virgin or a whore, it's very black and white. Donnie Darko wouldn't be very pleased about it. Molly Haskell discusses the virgin horror dichotomy in her book From Reverence to Rape, the treatment of women in movies. The virgin horror dichotomy took hold with a vengeance in the uptight 50s in the dialectical characters of the sex pot and the nice girls. The split was internalized in the moral code we adopted out of fear as well as out of instinct for self-preservation. The taboos against sex encoded rather in the paralyzing etiquette that no man should marry a woman who is not a virgin. She goes on to say that the virgin is a primal positive figure, honored and exalted beyond any marriage she possessed as a woman, while the whore, Americanized into the good bad girl, was publicly castigated and cautioned against and privately sought by men. I think it's a really great explanation by Allison in the film Breakfast Club, written by John Hughes from the 80s. Well, if you say you haven't, you're a prude. And if you say you have, you're a slut. It's a trap. You don't want, you want to, but you can't. And when you do, you wish you didn't, right? Right, girl. Totally correct. The virgin horror dichotomy has become an ingrained trope and created archetypes in all genres of film, not and storytelling for that matter. But it's especially noticeable in horror films and teen films, particularly ones from the 80s. And we can see parodies of this in like Cabin in the Woods and The Final Girl, where characters are slotted into these roles like they're chess pieces or characters in Clue. In Cabin in the Woods, the characters are given specific types of roles to play: the virgin, the whore, the athlete, the fool, and the scholar. The virgin in the film isn't actually even a virgin. She simply just abstains during that weekend, or more specifically, during the runtime of the film. I maybe should have mentioned above. Well, okay. The rest of the cast is filled out by men who are cast as archetypes that have nothing to do with their sex or sexual activity, but their actual personalities: the fool, the athlete, and the scholar. The girl and women in the group are uh, only worth in character is defined specifically by their sexual activity and sex appeal. Man, Laura Mulvey's male gaze isn't wrong. Also, the whore character is typically depicted not just as sexually active, but as sexually obsessed. My takeaway is that there is this black and white, hard this or that thinking, the dichotomy, as I said. It's created in a patriarchal structured society to ensure that girls and women remain chaste and virginal until they are married. This is encouraged through positive negative reinforcements such as social status, like reputation. The reason it was important in the past is because men were the property owners, the money earners, the ones who were allowed to have a job and get fair pay and be educated, the ones who furthered the family name and lineage. Really, everything. It's another way to keep women in line. And I kind of think it's to ensure paternity. I could be wrong, but it seems like that's what it might be. Women legally relied on men to be able to live and exist in society, and men were taught they wanted to marry a woman who had a hymen, if I can oversimplify, and buy a house and have a job and have 2.5 kids and worship God. And for some reason, this relies on subjugating women. I don't understand why it relies on subjugating women, but that just seems to be the thing. Virginity is associated with purity. I don't know, meaning sex is dirty. Antonyms for purity include sin, contaminated, corrupted, dishonest, immodest, obscene, tainted, vulgar. Marriage is this sacred situation in which an otherwise dirty act can be forgiven. I wrote in my notes, does God like porn? Is sex within the confines of marriage just porn for God? I love when I make little notes in the margins because I'm weird. Anyway, what's the push for binding monogamous heteronormative relationships in religion? I gotta think it has to do with paternity. That's the only thing that I can logic out. Otherwise, it just doesn't make sense. Like, and because there's an entitlement to a woman, you see this woman, a man sees his wife as his property. No one else should be touching it. I can't think of any other reasons. Like I really tried, and I tried. Yeah, it's about ownership. I'm repeating myself. I'm sorry. So let's talk about the imprisonment known as marriage and women's rights, or rather lack thereof. I'll sum up two articles about marriage. One is from Lauren Everett, who wrote 10 Key Moments in the History of Marriage for the BBC, and the other article is simply called Marriage on the Encyclopedia Britannica. Would you call it an article? I am. It's the encyclopedia. Marriage in its early days was about economics. Everett writes, during the 11th century, marriage was about securing an economic or political advantage. The wishes of married couples, much less their consent, were of little importance. The bride, particularly, was assumed to bow to her father's wishes, and and the marriage arrangements were made on her behalf. Further, the church placed and still does an importance on procreation. Marriage is about money and making babies because it's easier to indoctrinate children than adults. Love is a modern myth made up by people who don't want women to realize that they are being sold off to make a new generation of laborers while having little rights or choices of their own. So, yeah, marriage is, in my kind, a form of confinement that women were groomed into believing they wanted so they wouldn't raise concerns about their long lack of rights. And everything was going just peachy for the patriarchy until those world wars took place and took said workforce of boys and men off to war, leaving women and differently abled men and older men to get a chance to really enter the workforce. And didn't that open some eyes? Yep. According to the US Department of Labor, during World War I, the number of women in industry increased greatly, and the range of occupations open to them was extended, even though they remained concentrated in occupations such as domestic and personal service, clerical occupations, and factory work. In 1920, women were about 20% of all persons in the workforce. Today, women make up about 47% of US labor force. And sadly, minority groups really have to battle for these rights, and it's still happening. Kate McLaughlin wrote in Five Things Women Couldn't Do in the 60s for CNN. I'll just do her five things, just the list. Serve on a jury, get an Ivy League education, experience workplace equality, get a credit card, or go on birth control pill. And we're still fighting for equitable, not equality, equitable treatment in society, and even over the choices that we make regarding our own bodies. Ugh. To sum up, to maintain the status quo of the patriarchal order, women need to be relegated to property. This happens through heteronormative marriage and putting the literal fear of God into girls to remain chaste, I guess. I don't know. It doesn't make sense to me as an atheist who grew up in the 21st century. I honestly don't understand the need for virginal weddings. Again, I think it has, something to do with like STDs and bloodlines and entitlement. Mostly bloodlines. We just really need to make sure we know who the daddy is. You know what I mean? So let's move on slightly to purity culture. I'll give a basic Wikipedia definition. Purity culture places a strong emphasis on abstinence from sexual intercourse before marriage. In Abstinence Cinema, Virginity and the Rhetoric of Sexual Purity in Contemporary Film by Casey Ryan Kelly, she explains abstinence until marriage is a defining feature of fundamentalist Christian sexual morality. So boring and vanilla. Christians have purportedly practiced abstinence until marriage for centuries, and the rise of the moral majority movement in the early 1980s is credited with bringing up biblical understanding of sexuality into the American public sphere. In a groundbreaking violation of the Baptist Church's longtime separation of religion and politics, Reverend Jerry Falwell founded the Moral Majority as a national organization designed to mobilize evangelical voters and lobby for the implementation of Christian principles in public policy. Sidebar. So take it with a grain of salt because I just read about this on the Wikipedia thing. What drove supposedly Reverend Jerry Falwell, who was a televangelist, if you don't know, to like start the Moral Majority was the desegregation of schools. So like what got his panties in a twist and what he thought God just wouldn't be for was black children going to school with white children. What a douchebag. Back to the quote from Abstinence Cinema. The emergence of abstinence until marriage as the centerpiece of the new right, beginning in the mid-1980s, can be explained in part by the movement's disdain for feminism and the sexual revolution. So not only was he like in love with racism, he was against feminism. Just what a great guy. You know what I mean? What a great guy. What a great movement. Really. Oh, Jesus. A lot of censorship efforts in media and schools push for abstinence education, aka non-education. And as someone, again, who went to public school, yep, purity culture, and purity, whoa, let me try that one more time. A lot of censorship efforts in media and schools push for abstinence education, and purity culture are spearheaded by religious, specifically Christian organizations. And based on my accidental viewing of Blue Lagoon in high school, I can confirm knowing where babies come from is super important. And knowing how sex works is important. Like, those are important things that we should be educated on. Oh my gosh. We'll move on. So according to Gallup, in their article, How Religious Are Americans? I'm going to give out a lot of numbers. I'm so sorry. In 1973, 87% of US adults identified with a Christian religion, and 5% did not have a religious preference. In comparison to their 2023 data, which I obtained from their nifty chart, 50 years later, adults identifying as Christian or a very sect of Christianity dropped from 87% to 68%, which is a 19% drop. Meanwhile, adults who do not have a religious preference rose from 5 to 22%, which is a 17% rise, meaning less people identify as religious, which is also reflective in some of their other data points, such as declining church rates. So I think that's a good move forward, but again, atheist. The sexual revolution, for anyone who needs a refresher, occurred in the 1960s and 70s. Birth control pill went on the market in 1960, although it wasn't always easy for women to access it. Like a single woman wasn't always able to go on birth control pill, or even a married woman unless her husband was there to buy it for her. Really ridiculous. Anyway, that was basically the first time, provided she could get access to it, that a woman had ownership over a contraceptive device compared to like a condom, which a guy has to put on. I'm sorry, I don't mean to necessarily like make this like woman has vagina, man has penis, but in this conversation, I do think it's just a little bit easier to define it that way. I don't mean to be exclusionary, but we are talking about the 60s, which was exclusionary by definition. Anyway, we'll move on. Roe v. Wade legalized abortions in 1973, and I gotta say, writing this in 2024 hurts my soul. Stonewall happened in 1969, which didn't necessarily push the sexual revolution forward, but it didn't pull it back either. Queer people were fighting for their rights before then, of course, but that in 1969 was when it became much more visible. And additionally, importantly, drugs are getting better. So in a pre-AIDS world in the 60s and 70s, STDs were a lot easier to treat. Man, the past kind of seems better right now. This is sad. Another statistic that I thought was worth adding was teen pregnancy rates from 1974 to 1980 from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Females from age 15 to 19 years old experienced an 8.2% increase in pregnancy. However, the percentage of sexually experienced females decreased. So it looked like teenage girls were having less sex, but were more likely to get pregnant, probably because they weren't being educated. See, Blue Lagoon all over again. But that's not really the issue that religious and political figures had. The issue they had was that those pregnant girls weren't getting married. And somehow people thought that the remedy was to teach abstinence. Yeah, all right. That's one way to do it, I guess. Oh my God. Public school, I'm telling you. Side note, to bring the mood down a lot more, purity culture is kind of a facet of assault culture and causes assault victims to feel shame and often even responsibility for their own assault. So I don't know who needs to hear this, but that's not your fault. Anyone who made that choice to hurt you. And that certainly doesn't make you a bad person who is worth any less. So back to the scheduled programming. Let's talk about the film Teeth from 2007. The main character, Dawn, has pledged abstinence. Oh, spoilers for Teeth, I guess. She's pledged abstinence. She, being a teen, gets a crush on a boy. Typical teenage things. But when he tries to assault her, oh my gosh, the teeth in her vagina castrate him. Then vagina dentata powers activated. Yes, girl. And through a series of misencounters, she learns that the teeth only come out when the situation is not consensual. And though she has lost her innocence, so to speak, I don't know, she becomes empowered. I like this movie. I know a lot of people don't. A lot of people do not consider it to be feminist. I do. I think it's good for her. Something bad happened to her, but she took ownership and she learned something new and valuable about her body that is a defense mechanism, and I appreciate it. And then spoilers for the film It Follows. I think we also see this in It Follows. And I know, yes, 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 it's called the STD movie. And that's a very obvious, visible metaphor for the film. But is there any movie that is more sex equals death than It Follows? That's like the literal plot. You have sex and you literally die. No movie exemplifies this trope more than It Follows. It's the perfect metaphor for this as well. A young girl has premarital sex and then is stalked by a slasher ghost demon thingy until it either kills her or moves on to the next sexually active youth that she has sex with. But it ends up coming full circle back around to her. Insert scary music. It's very much that. And I think the film also could be read as a loss of innocence as well as like the STD movie. Um, and it's kind of about spreading that loss of innocence and that yeah, sin. That's a deep movie. I think it has a lot of readings and people just go for the obvious kind of one about STDs, but I think there's other stuff that's working there also that you can watch it through that lens and get a lot from it. Good film, great film. One of the best films of one of the best horror films of the last 20 years. Anyway, back to the scheduled programming. To paraphrase rather what I read in Abstinent Cinema, Virginity and the Rhetoric of Sexual Purity in Contemporary Film by Casey Ryan Kelly, the moral majority and conservative politicians were pushing the traditional values agenda to protect the children. Sure, Jan. And I'll add that we see this a lot of places in the 60s to the 80s, like the film rating system, which I'll discuss later, and the parental advisory stickers for music and so on. And I do think that there are some things children should be shielded from. Absolutely. However, this idea of like childhood innocence is kind of a new thing. We couldn't have this notion of protecting the children until pretty recently. Well, okay, within the last 150 years, but in terms of like human history, that's pretty recent, right? Once we started making those pesky child labor laws. Before that, it was kids. Oh, you mean the little workers who might continue the family bloodline if they're a boy. Julie C. Garland writes in Interrogating Innocence, Childhood as Exclusionary Social Practice. That the construct of childhood innocence is a powerful social myth. She goes on to paraphrase Britzman from 1998. I have all of my sources linked, so you can find all these and the quotes and stuff. This fantasy of childhood as a blissful epoch of carefree enchantment is a powerful social construct that scripts an expectation for what children's experiences should be like and incites parental anxiety, fueled for some by the nostalgia for our remembered childhoods, and for others by the desire to protect our children from the traumas we ourselves endured. This anxiety drives many parents to great lengths to guard their children from sadness and stress and even mild discomfort, a desire to prolong children's unawareness of social realities by centering topics such as sexuality, death, violence, and poverty that constitute forms of difficult knowledge. So, to track back a little bit to the virgin horror dichotomy, a girl is either a virgin, locked in naive childhood innocence, or a whore, having shed that purity and entered into corrupt adult world. So let's talk about Twilight. It's a segue and a half. Not that I tricked everyone into listening to this so I can go on a rant about Twilight, because that would be evil. That would be maniacal. Who would ever do such a thing? Me? Okay, so hear me out. I know Stephanie Myers dislikes when people bring up that she's a Mormon, but I'm sorry. It really shows very prominently in her story. And she also dissed Anne Rice, so I kind of don't care about her feelings on this. The main character, Bella, I guess spoilers for Twilight. The main character, Bella, is courted by her psycho vampire love interest, Edward. I take Technically they're both 17 to 18 question mark. So they date for like it's like 2 years, right? Question mark on that one. And decide that they'll be together forever, which is a very teenage thing to think. So Edward should go ahead and change her into a vampire too. That way that they still look around the same age. But he only agrees on the condition that she marry him first. Sounding very abstinence, purity culture to me, baby. Further, they can't have sex until they're married, which doesn't make sense because the argument originally for abstaining before was that he's a strong vampire boy and she's a weak female human, so he'll hurt her. But once they get married and they are within the confines of marriage, they do have sex before she's a vampire, and it's totally fine. So why were you abstaining before marriage? Make it make sense. This is a vampire story, girl. Come on. Anyway, she's actually so human, so pre-vampire, if you will. She gets pregnant. Fuck's sake. And then it becomes this anti-abortion book, even at the expense of the health of the woman. Wow, great. So healthy. Then she has the evil CGI baby, and her werewolf ex-boyfriend boy toy thing decides he's destined to be together with evil CGI baby, which I'm sorry, that is I don't want to be anti-Mormon, but I don't know. I listen to a lot of true crime podcasts, and I know of like 5 ones about like Mormons, and it's not cute. And this is kind of giving that. It's giving pedo. Okay, it's creepy. It's weird. It's gross. It's inappropriate. Why is it in there? Edit, girl. Edit. Editors, please like call people out to do better. Anyway, so Edward and Bella live happily ever married after. And if this isn't abstinence propaganda, I literally don't know what is. Again, I went to public school and I was in junior high when these came out. And I'm telling you, man, they lined up with what I was getting in my public school health class. Okay, 1-to-1 ratio, really. Real quick before we get, and by we I mean me, because I'm clearly not mentally well after all this. Before we get further into talking about virgin sacrifices, which is the typical totally fine thing that someone would research and just bring up. Yeah, totally sane. I'm doing really great right now. um, I need to add another piece of context, and that is censorship. Particularly in this case, since we're talking about films, I need to talk about the rating system a little bit. The movie rating system was okay, it's complicated, but like the MPA, previously MPAA, movie rating system was instituted in 1968. The ratings in their name and what would earn that rating have changed because our culture has evolved in the past 56 years. I really hope 1968 was 68 or was 56 years ago because I just did that math in my head and now I'm doubting myself. Fingers crossed. But basically, we have a general anyone can go G rating. We have a little parental guidance is recommended, PG. The movie is restricted for 17 years and older unless accompanied by an adult, which is R. We have a restricted to people 18 years and older, no exception. So if you're 17 and you come with your parent, you still cannot get in, which is now known as NC-17, used to be called X. And in 1984, PG-13 was added as a warning that the film is likely not for younger children, but is not restrictive like R or NC-17. Meaning even if you're 12 years old, you can get a ticket to a PG-13 movie without a parent accompanying you. Okay. Oops. So what's important to note is that how this changed the way that sex and nudity could be depicted in a movie or TV show. Well, one that wanted to be released in theaters in any way. You could release it unrated, but it wouldn't be carried in any theater that's NATO, like National Association of Theater Owners. So like Regal, AMC, they're not going to distribute a movie that's not rated. But a small, like local owned theater might. Probably going to be in like LA or New York, though. Maybe Chicago, a bigger city. You probably have something like that. Maybe drive-ins back in the day. I'm off topic. Back to the notes. So yeah, what's important is that they changed the way that sex and nudity could be depicted in film, and that they now could be. Before, it was like Ricky and Lucy fully dressed, sleeping on different beds in their room, separated by a nightstand. You know what I mean? Sad. We couldn't have movies about killing virgins until we could show and talk about them in said movies. Of course, foreign films were held to their own censorship standards. So there were films that predated stuff like that. Like particularly in like France, I can think of. The 1970s, though, when we had the institution of the rating system, Shaw saw an explosion of sexploitation films. Girl, so many lesbian vampire films. So many lesbian vampire films. The rating system also allowed for more violence than the previous system, which was colloquially known as the Hays Code. So while there were certainly horror films before 1968, we didn't really get like the father of the slashers until 1978 with Halloween. Before we have, proto slashers. The rating system is still a bit misogynist, though. James King explains in his book The Ultimate History of the 80s Teen Movie, which I absolutely recommend. Phenomenal read. In regards to Amy Heckerling's Fast Times at Ridgemont High, the MPAA, in another blow, had told Heckerling she needed to cut out any male nudity if she didn't want the picture to end up with a restrictive X rating, despite the female nudity seeming to pose no problem. And it's pretty well known that the MPA is much more harsh about nudity than it is violence as well. And that's just like a cultural thing. For instance, in Europe, they're a bit more harsh on violence than nudity. America's just like violence. We're fine with that. Nudity. No. Female nudity? Worse. Vaginas are scary. No. And penises? Those don't exist. We can't show those in a film. No way. Ridiculous. But just as the MPA is more harsh on nudity than violence, it's a pretty ubiquitous fact that sex sells. And we'll get a little more into that a little later. So the Teenage Slasher movie book, second revised and expanded edition by J.A. Kirschwell, also phenomenal book, would recommend, taught me so much about the history of the slasher film. If you look through proto slashers from like 1926, The Bat, to 1978's Halloween, and everything in between, you'll find Halloween really was, from what I could find, really like the first one to really be about teenagers. Doing my own research, I can't say that Rebel Without a Cause from 1955 was like the first ever teen movie, but it was the first real big one. And certainly many followed, including horror movies like The Blob from 1958. In 1962, Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of Nabokov's 1955 novel Lolita was the first one I could find that was a film overtly and explicitly about sexualizing a teen in film. And yikes. I hate that movie. I hate what it's about. I just really detest it. I think it's really disgusting. I think they do a terrible job at adapting it. Man, it's really inappropriate. And if you look up what happened to the girl that they sexualized, it was not good for her. Really unfortunate. Anyway, The Ultimate History of the 80s Teen Movie by James King, meanwhile, taught me a lot about teen movies. Again, great book. The 70s saw not only the rise of the slasher, but of the teen movie. And they both kind of exploded into the mainstream at the end of the 70s and carried the 80s. From American Graffiti to Porky's to The Outsiders and John Hughes's, well, pretty much his whole filmography in the 80s anyway. Teen movies were huge, and a lot of them remain classics to this day. And the slasher subgenre to rise the powers that be, the financiers, needed to realize teenagers were a willing audience and had money to spend. And they did. So to sum up, with the institution of the MPA's rating system, sex and violence, could be depicted on screen. This coincided with the sexual revolution and the rise of movies marketed to and about teenagers. It was just seriously a perfect storm. So, about virgin sacrifices. Man, I'm nailing these segues. I don't know about anyone else, but I always thought that virgin sacrifices at some point in history were like very common, or at least something that happened that was like a big event, like the Inquisition or the witch trials. I tried doing research and I found very little, not nothing, but it wasn't like this common practice and there wasn't like this hugely famous case. In film, however, virgin sacrifices aren't super uncommon from like Conan the Barbarian, Dragnet, The Babysitter, The Wicker Man. It can be found across all genres, dating from modern films at least back to the 1970s. Typically, a virgin or pure sacrifices is needed for a cult to get their powers or crops. Because pagan deities and Satan like people who haven't had sex, I guess. I don't get it. But that's the thing. That's the pattern. That's what I saw. I found it interesting that The Babysitter and The Wicker Man, the original Wicker Man with Christopher Lee, both used males as the virginal sacrifice, almost inverting the gender role. First, as the focus of a horror movie in general, and secondly, as someone whose sex status matters. Culturally speaking, I'm reiterating myself here, but culturally speaking, men are supposed to abstain from premarital sex, but their moral character is not hinging on that. Plus, there is an expectation that men are obsessed with sex and therefore, as an adult anyway, not virginal, like in The Wicker Man, but he was Catholic. So that's interesting. In 2009, it's used for great subversion of expectation in Jennifer's Body, where a non-virgin is sacrificed and is able to return empowered as a succubus in order to get her revenge. Although then it turns kind of homophobic and into a Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge, but that's neither here nor there. And a similar plot can also be found in Belladonna of Sadness from 1973, wherein a woman is assaulted and then her husband rejects her after that. Gross. Kill him, girl. And then she gets haunted by a disembodied penis demon, and it have relations, and then she becomes a flower and a powerful witch. It's an interesting movie, Belladonna of Sadness. Check it out. We'll move on. Vampires needing virgin blood started in the 70s, I think, or from what I can find. In films, not in books, in films. And I assume it has something to do with viewing, again, virgins as more clean. I have no basis in this. It's just a theory. Vampires Are Us, understanding our love affair with the immortal dark by Margaret Adler writes, Le Morte d'Arthur by Sir Thomas Malory is this 1485 compilation of romantic tales, included one from 1470, which features a woman vampire. She needs the blood of royal virgins to survive. So I wondered if that was inspired by Elizabeth Bathory, but upon Googling, I found that she actually wasn't accused of murdering anyone until the 1600s. So this short story preceded that by 130 years, which is interesting. But I did want to give a little background about Elizabeth Bathory. I just did this from Wikipedia. So the most common motif of these works was that the Countess bathing in her virginal victim's blood to retain beauty or youth. This legend appeared in print for the first time in 1729 in a Jesuit scholar, Laszlo Tersuis. Nope, did not pronounce that right. I have it on screen. Not going to go further. The first written account of the Bathory case was, again, 1729. The earliest occurrence that I can find this plot point happening was Blood for Dracula in 1974. And it's shown that a non-virginal blood makes Dracula violently ill, as if their previous dirty act poisoned his blood. Further, Dracula needs virginal blood specifically to remain young. By not getting it, he ages. Later, to save a girl from being bitten by Dracula, this man literally assaults her. She's like 12, by the way. So she's no longer a virgin. This movie's really weird, and I love it. Watch it. By 1985, it's used as a parody in Once Bitten, and this movie's lore is a female vampire. Usually, it's a female vampire who needs virginal blood. Again, don't know why. To drink the blood of a virgin 3 times before a full moon to remain young, and she complains how difficult it is to find a virgin in this day and age, so she's relegated to drinking the blood of a nerdy teen boy, played by Jim Carrey. What a great film. In Monster Squad from 1987, a virgin is required to read from a magical book so that it could suck all the monsters into it. This boy contracts one of his older sisters to help, but finds it doesn't work because she's technically not a virgin, because Steve doesn't count. Doesn't count. They end up having to use his toddler. I don't know, she's like 5. That's a toddler, right? Little sister to do it because I guess, I don't know, none of the 12-year-old boys are virgins. Nope, has to be a virginal girl because girls are the only ones who matter in this case. Again, it's misogynist. To sum up, okay, historically, virgins in stories or horror stories are used as victims of cults to sacrifice or vampires to lure in to remain young because their blood's cleaner, I guess. Okay, dokie. I guess we can finally start talking about slashers on page 15 of my notes because I am one long-winded bitch. I originally was inspired to write this massive existential spiral after I saw the study. I'm repeating myself here. On the perils of living dangerously in the slasher horror film, gender differences in the association between sexual activity and survival by Andrew Walsh. This is a quantitative study that looked at 50 North American slasher films that were released between 1960 and 2009, which I think is way too wide of a year span to analyze. I wouldn't look at anything made before the MPA's rating system was instituted in 1968. And even then, I probably wouldn't even consider anything a slasher before 1974. At the earliest, 1978 to be more fair, especially if their sample size is only 50 films. Anyway, to quote Walsh, wow, the slasher horror film has been deplored based on claims that it depicts eroticized violence against predominantly female characters as punishment for sexual activities. He goes on to explain that results indicated that sexual female characters were less likely to survive and had significantly longer death scenes as compared to those female characters who did not engage in sexual behaviors. I'll add that female characters were less likely to survive and had significantly longer death scenes in compared to male characters who engaged in sexual activities as well. In a similar analysis done by J.A. Kershwell in his book, The Teenage Slasher Movie Book, second revised edition, despite women shedding their clothes in classic slasher movies, when up against a psycho with a machete, it was more dangerous to be a man. In 175 films made between 78 and 84, a much better time frame, by the way. Some 558 of the 1,046 on-screen fatalities were male as opposed to 488 female deaths. And for the math impaired, that would be 53.3% men to 46.7% women. I'm going to give a lot of statistics here. I apologize, but I'm going to get to my point after reading them all. Okay. Then we get to Sarah Lukowski states in her essay, Female Victimization in 70s and 80s Slasher Film. All right. Although research states that men are killed more in slashers, conflicting with slasher film definitions, context analysis have found scenes of women being tortured are extended for the pleasure of the male audience. Lukowski cites Weaver, whose essay is Are Slasher Horror Films Sexually Violent? A content analysis where they analyzed 10 films from the 70s and 80s. Female victims are displayed on screen in fear longer than their male counterparts. The average death scene for a female character was 217.2 seconds compared to the scenes involving males, which was 107.2 seconds. So more than double. although women are victimized at greater time lengths. Lukowski paraphrases Cohen and O'Brien's study, Gender and Survival versus Death in Slasher Films, a content analysis, who analyzed 56 films from the 70s and 80s. With a total of 447 victims, they found female and male victims were portrayed equally. However, when discussing survival, women were more likely to survive than men, going against the common conception in slasher definitions and public perceptions. This echoed their results of 242 male victims, 90% resulted in, or of the 242 male victims, 90% resulted in death. Their research revealed a large portion, 33 to 35%, of all non-surviving victims engaged in sex prior to their death, suggesting and supporting similar research with sex and other violence. Female non-survivors were more promiscuous than male non-survivors by wearing revealing clothing or showing nudity on screen, and therefore more frequently engaged in sexual acts before death. Lukowski also looked at Molitor and Sapolsky's study, Sex, Violence, and Victimization in Slasher Films, where they analyzed 30 slasher films released in the 80s. 44.4% female and 55.6% male supporting the previous studies. That was the death rate comparison. The juxtaposition of violence following sex rarely occurred. Of the 1,877 violent incidents coded, there were 92 scenes that displayed violence during or preceding sexual activity, regardless of gender. They examined the extent to which their characters are shown in fear and found slasher films put fear on display for an average of 670.8 seconds. According to the research, women were shown in fear an average of 566.1 seconds and men for only 113.7 seconds. So this is over 4 times more. And then Lukowski concludes, men are killed more quickly, resulting in more male deaths, but women are more slowly and for the pleasure of the audience. I'll reiterate. Men are killed more quickly, resulting in more male deaths, but women more slowly for the pleasure of the audience. Make it male audience. Okay. Lastly, on this subject, I'll add a quote by Ashley Wellman's essay, Lady and the Vamp, Roles of Sexualization and Brutalization of Women in Slasher Films, where she analyzed 48 slasher films released between the 1960s and 2010. Sorry, had to take a drink. Okay. Sexualization, strength. Made a typo. Strength, something brutalization, and fate were coded 252 female characters. Results indicate that purity was significantly related to lower brutalization and lower rates of death for all women. Actual potential victims were brutalized and killed most for their sexualization. These messages reinforce ideas of gender roles, stereotypes, and relationship expectations by punishing female sexualization and demonizing female sex. Issues of violence against women, toxic masculinity, rape culture, and the normalization of combining violence and sex are significant concerns. I'm concluding that males are more often victims in slasher films, but women are shown in fear longer and are more likely to experience violence in a state of undress, which often makes their death scenes longer and more memorable. This, intentionally or not, relates sex to violence, which simply is an unhealthy connection. So why do we this is a side tangent, but why do we consider a knife stabbing a person a metaphor for a penis entering a vagina? No, actually. Why are we making the allegory an assumed violence against women? Also, sex should not be painful, and a knife actually is not phallic. If you have a penis and it looks like a knife, you should see someone about that, because that's not what they should be shaped like. And sex should not be painful. We need to stop telling girls, when you lose your virginity, it's going to be painful. It's not. It should not be painful. There might be discomfort. Sure, totally. There may or may not be blood. Sure, totally. Probably won't be blow. And there probably won't be blood. And it probably will be a little uncomfortable at first because you're new at this. And it takes a while to figure out what you like and don't like and how lubricated things need to be and so on and so forth. Uh, so yeah, like, but it's not painful and it shouldn't be painful. We need to do better. Stop scaring girls. Stop making men and sex seem more violent than it is. It's weird and untrue, and it's propaganda for assault culture, in my opinion. Culturally, we can and should have a way healthier relationship to sex. So let's talk about Summer Party Massacre 2. The greatest segue I've ever had in my freaking life, and I'm maintaining that. Spoilers, I guess, for Summer Party Massacre 2. That's a weird sentence. So it works as a metaphor for fear of sex, not only because the driller killer's phallic weapon, in this case, the drill is kind of phallic. A knife still isn't. The film has the survivor of the previous film, or one of the three, now confronting her sexuality, not like a queer way, but in like a she likes a boy and she's considering having sex. So it's getting into those like repressed sexual thoughts that give you weird dreams, Freudian bullshit, which I hate. But she has nightmares about this rockabilly guitar playing killer who has a drill at the end of his guitar. It sounds weird because it is, but it's great. And it's one of my favorite movies. Anyway, he and her sister keep warning her about going all the way. And then murders happen because sexual repression, I guess. Is that the movie? I think that's the movie. But yeah, it works a little like that. But the idea of like someone being so afraid of sex that they end up murdering people. See what I'm saying? Let's be healthier because it ain't healthy. And with that, I want to talk about Halloween 6. That might be my worst segue. I went from my highest of high to my lowest of low. This is from Wikipedia about Daniel Ferrans, who wrote a number of treatments for Halloween 6. Ferrand describes Michael Myers as a sexual deviant. According to him, the way Michael follows girls around and watching them contains a subtext of repressed sexuality. Ferrans theorizes that as a child, Michael became fixated on the murder of his sister Judith, and for his own twisted reason, he felt he needed to repeat that action over and over again, finding a sister-like figure in Laurie who excited him sexually. I tried to do research on sexually motivated serial killers, but okay, like long story short, I bounced off that topic. It was dark, and my simple, sweet soul couldn't handle it. But sexual violence is most often perpetrated against women, and men are more often victims of homicide, but women are more likely to be victims of serial killers. Though typically if a woman is murdered, it's by her partner, and they say it's safer to be married. Side note, the whole man-made madman escaped from a hospital and is off killing people is ableist, and we need to stop doing that. Killing slashers for me. Anyway, ultimately, I find that sex after death trope does demonize sexual activity when it's a perfectly normal act. Further, horror slashers do exploit women's bodies, and while the final girl does get to be an action hero, every other woman in the movie is generally shown being in a state of terror and victims of violence, and it is an unhealthy depiction. My takeaway is misogyny. Go figure. Men are killed more, but women have longer, more grotesque death scenes and are showed being in a state of fear longer. I think this is because there is a larger sample size of men in film, meaning more men are hired to work in movies. So because there's more men in the cast, we have to kill more men off. Also, additionally, because a woman is more likely, a singular final girl is more likely to survive. of the fewer women who are allowed to work in the movie, one of them gets to live. So yes, more men are killed off on screen, but their death scenes are usually not as drawn out and they're usually more clothed. And that's why our kill counts tend to be more male skewed. Women are more likely to be killed post sex and nude and in a state of undress and have longer death scenes. I know I'm repeating myself, sorry. To me, given I'm biased, but these numbers scream misogyny. But it might not be misogyny in the way you'd be thinking. But I'll circle back around to that. Let's talk about Halloween. I'm only on page 20 of my notes. Oh my God. So a little background on Halloween from John Carpenter by Colin Odell and Michel LeBlanc, who write Carpenter's next project came about after an approach by producer Irwin Yablans. He had an idea for a cheap horror film called The Babysitter Murders, where a small town is subject to the attention of a serial killer who targets you because babysitters. Carpenter working with Deborah Hill expanded this basic concept and suggested that it should be played out during one night on a holiday renowned for its scary association. Deborah Hill provided most of the realism, basing matters on her own babysitting experiences and fears. The result was to become the biggest independent film of its time and one of the most influential horror pictures ever. Whoo, way to go. I don't think Deborah Hill gets enough credit, honestly. Sorry, I had to take a sip. The sex equals death trope is attributed often to John Carpenter's 1978 Halloween. However, I consider it to have been cemented as a trope, not by Halloween, but by Victor Miller and S. Sean Cunningham in their 1980 film Friday the 13th. And they're the real culprits, aren't they? As related in David Konow's book Real Terror, the scary, bloody, gory 100-year history of classic horror films. Miller was forced to see Halloween by Cunningham because he wasn't really familiar with horror and his takeaways were such. So quoting Miller here. And I saw the most important things with Halloween were you had to have a prior evil that happened before the movie begins. You had to have a location or a set of circumstances that prohibited the adult world from coming to the rescue of the sexually active adolescents. I needed a group of absolutely wonderful Pepsi generation kids to come in, about to have the most wonderful time of their lives, as long as it included getting laid. And there's a forced working behind the scenes you couldn't see until the very end. Then it was a question of establishing them, taking them out one by one and justifying why nobody knows what's going on. The other hard thing is justifying going in there, as in, don't go in there. And of course, after seeing Halloween so many times, you have the sex and you die etiquette also become part of the roadmap. So let's look at the actual kill count in the context of Halloween, Friday the 13th. Obviously, talking about the original 1978 and 1980 films. I guess spoilers for these. That sounds weird to say. All right. Michael Myers kills. So I'm doing kill counts here real fast. All right. Michael Myers. He kills undressed 15-year-old Judith Myers, his sister, post-sexual activity. But he lets her boy toy live, who we don't see undressed. We see him putting his shirt back on. Okay. 15 years later, he kills Annie in a state of undress on her way to see her boyfriend Bob. Then he kills Paul and Linda, both post-coitus. Okay. Linda's death was longer and more drawn out, and they were both shirtless, but Linda was definitely wearing less. We also have the trucker that he stole the jumpsuit from, and we have the survivors being Sheriff Brackett, Dr. Loomis, and good girl Lori. So the kill count is 5, survivor count is 4. All right. Friday the 13th. Mrs. Voorhees, yes, that's right, lady killer, kills a boy and a girl in the opening who are fully clothed and making out. We cut to the present time, which is, I think, 22 years later. I don't know, math. We're going to move on from that. We have a fully clothed Annie getting killed. Ned, Brenda, Bill, Steve, and Steve. I'm sorry. Let me try that again. Ned, Brenda, Bill, and Steve Christie are all killed off screen. Jack and Marcy are killed post boot knocking. Jack fully clothed and Marcy pantless. Our kill count is 9, and our survivors are 2, Crazy Ralph and Good Girl Alice. So we have in here a little bit more sexual activity in Friday the 13th, but nudity would be about the same, though we have more people surviving Michael than we have people surviving Mrs. Voorhees, and Mrs. Voorhees killed more people, almost double the amount of people than Michael. All right. So Mrs. Voorhees also was specifically targeting young sexually active youth because, you know, they were making love when they should have been watching my boy Jason. So she had a vendetta. Whereas Michael, it just seemed to happen. Although I do think it's interesting what Fran said about him being a sexual deviant because he's a serial killer, and I think a lot of serial killers are perceived that way, whether or not the FBI would consider that to be true or not. Question mark. Who knows? There are movies where the killer does specifically target sexually active youth. Like I said, Friday the 13th, that does seem to be the motif, as well as, for instance, Silent Night, Deadly Night, where poor Billy got tortured by Mother Superior, then was forced to face his traumas and snapped. And he went on a killing spree, taking the life of anyone he deemed naughty, which definitely included the sexually active R.I.P. Linnea Quigley. I mean, not actually, obviously, she's still alive, but like her character. A Silent Night, Deadly Night might be one of the best slashers ever made, and it just doesn't get the credits for that because of Silent Night, Deadly Night 2, which is unfortunate. Anyway, we'll move on. The sex equals death in the slasher is one of the most defining tropes in slashers compared to like all the other tropes. To quote, "It was all a dream, an anthology of bad horror tropes done right by Brandon Applegate. Jaded audiences prefer familiarity while also craving the unknown. Instead of resisting, one might choose to go with the weight of a century of genre tradition, genre conditioning, formula, and convention. What an author can't break, they subvert." So to contrast this, there are parodies and subversions of this trope. I already talked about mentioned Cabin in the Woods and The Final Girls briefly. So Scream and Cherry Falls. So warning for spoilers for those movies. Scream, 1996. This isn't the first meta horror movie ever, but it's often given credit as such. But it was definitely the biggest. This movie pointed out 80s tropes overtly, hence it's meta. And I quoted in the opening, it really subverted it. The repressed final girl has sex with the killer and lives. Huzzah! The trend has thus been broken. We can do it now. And Cherry Falls, which ended up being a TV movie, that movie has a crazy history from 1999. This movie is so weird. The killer was specifically targeting virgins rather than sexually active teens, which totally makes sense because he would know who was or wasn't a virgin. Right, we'll move on. So the teens of Cherry Falls, get it? Cherry, popping cherry, Cherry Falls. Get it? Get it? Do you get it? Do you get it? Decide to have an orgy to lose their virginities to protect themselves from the killer, which is very similar to the movie I mentioned earlier, Blood for Dracula. This movie doesn't make any sense. It's weird. It's hilarious. It's uncomfortable. I love it. I love it so much. But yeah, it's just kind of making fun of that trope. And it's instead of like the killer targeting the sexually active youth, it's the killer targeting virgins because he hates rape culture. I don't understand. It doesn't make sense. We'll move on. The movie sure did. Ultimately, the trope is another form of slut shaming. We don't know for canon fact that Lori is a virgin. Maybe she's shy because she dated an a-hole and now she's closed off. Many of these films suppose that if a teen has had sex once, they're out there effing their brains out every weekend, which is not true. And I think it's common for someone to not have sex regularly when they're younger, but like maybe have their first time and then not have their second time for like months later. I feel like that's very typical, especially if their first time wasn't very good, which is also typical if you're in high school. It goes back to the virgin whore dichotomy. It's this hard line of either or. If you've had sex, then you're having sex and you're a slut and you should die. Jesus. It reminds me of learning about like queer topics in public, like in my public school education, rearing its ugly head out here. If you're gay, you'll have sex and you'll get AIDS and die. Or if you're a teenager and you have sex, you'll get pregnant and die. That was literally what I was taught in school. Isn't that great? Isn't that healthy? It's so healthy. Public schools in the US are super great. Let me tell you, wonderful. What I'm saying, to move on, just because a teen girl who is babysitting a kid, by the way, and not having sex on Halloween doesn't mean they're a virgin. And further, just because they're shy doesn't mean they're a virgin. And just because they're an extrovert doesn't mean they're a slut and not a virgin. These don't actually have much to do with each other. Yeah. Further, on the slut shaming train, wish I hadn't called it that. Introverted girls aren't necessarily virgins. We just need to stop with this. And I don't know who needs to hear this, but I'll add clothing also has nothing to do with sexual activity either. Thank you for your time. It's a cultural bias. So the definition from the APA, which is the American Psychology Association, of cultural bias is the tendency to interpret and judge phenomena in terms of distinctive values, beliefs, and other characteristics of society or community to which one belongs. And I think it has to do, it kind of goes along with interpolation, aka indoctrination. So to describe interpolation from Notes on Interpolation, quote, the term interpolation, which, I'm sorry, let me try that one more time, but with words. The term interpolation was an idea introduced by Louis Althusser, now I say his name right, Jesus, to explain the way in which ideas get into our heads and have an effect on our lives. So much so that cultural ideas have such a hold on us that we believe they are our own. Interpolation is a process in which we encounter our culture's values and internalize them. Interpolation expresses the idea that an idea is not simply yours alone, but rather an idea that has been presented for you to accept. Ideologies, our attitudes towards gender, class, race, should be thought more of as a social process. Accepting or not accepting a culture's given attitude places one in a particular relationship with power. Ideologies, therefore, play a crucial role first in constructing our identities and then giving us a particular place in society. To say that someone is fully interpolated is to say that he or she has successfully brought into accepting a certain role, or that he or she has accepted values willingly. End quote. An example is girls liking pink. It's likely they didn't come to that on their own, but rather were taught that they should like pink and therefore do. And the same with boys in blue. The virgin whore dichotomy, to me, is something like that. It is learned through our culture and reinforced by media and education, unfortunately. It becomes a vicious cycle that's hard to break. And you need to see the problem before you can snap out of it and subvert it, which is why parodies and genre exploration films are important. I'm sorry, genre deconstruction films, rather. To me, this is what's happening to John Carpenter and Deborah Hill when making Halloween in 1978. They had been interpolated into the virgin whore dichotomy and the gender roles presented to them by our culture. And I think the logic here is two-sided. One, from within the context of the film and from the external context of selling the film. from within the internal context of the film, it makes sense to have a character distracted with their mind on something else, in this case, sex, and in a vulnerable state of undress, and less likely to be able to fight back against a killer or to run away because they're more concerned about, their body. They're more vulnerable. The external logic is sex sells. We got to get that obligatory tit shots. Laura Mulvey, again, right about the male gaze. Women's bodies are sexualized to be sold. Fact. It's a fact. It's not about virginity. It's about having sex or not on screen during the runtime of the film. And the argument is about how distracted and vulnerable the person is. That makes total sense. Behind the scenes, it's also about showing a nude woman to get boys and men to come see the movie. And having a kill post sex scene just makes sense. It really does, but unintentionally and reinforces very negative representations of sexual activity and promotes purity culture. Further, I believe unintentionally it shows the creators having accepted the virgin whore dichotomy to be true. And by we, I mean I didn't get women being villainized for their sexual empowerment, which started back in the 1940s, according to Molly Haskell and From Reverence to Rape. Or I didn't get into it, but it's true. Like, you can see this with the femme fatale character, which later evolved into the bisexual evil woman in the 80s, into the early 2000s. To summarize my 24 pages of nonsense, sex equals death trope sucked and blew its way through the 70s and 90s. Just knocking boots everywhere. And it exists due to sexist attitudes towards women, albeit I fully believe subconsciously. Let women be sexual without it being equated to violence, and and we don't always need to be selling movies to men. Like, we need more empowerment. This trope reinforces negative and harmful myths about sex and sexuality to girls who watch horror. Like, girls watch horror movies and you're teaching them really negative things and to feel badly about themselves and to fear sex. And that's just not healthy. And we can do better. That's it. That's the end. Let women be sexual without negative repercussions. Yep. Okay. Thank you for listening. Sorry about my nonsense. And now, if you excuse me, I have some oozing to do. Stay with the rainbow.